Well, welcome to this short video on strategies to promote understanding. We're going to look at a direct instruction model and literally hundreds of different types of assessments, either diagnostic, formative, or summative, that you could use as you teach in this direct instruction model. In our field, in education, our societies have argued for centuries over 5 questions. What should be taught? And we don't have to look far in today's headlines to see that this is still raging in our communities as far as what history should be taught, what English should be taught, or textbooks should be used, and the like. Who should decide? Should it be boards of education, state boards of education, or a national curriculum? Who should decide is one of the major 5 questions. And then who should be taught? What kids should be taught where? Uh, Another 2 questions that we're going to look at is in this model, how should it be taught and how should it be assessed? So let's center on these two and see if this model would work for you. We have an old assessment paradigm where we used to teach what we wanted to teach in the public school. A teacher had a fantasy, desire to teach Shakespeare, and might spend the whole semester on that, regardless of what the curriculum said, but taught simply because that teacher thought it was important. And then we would test it to see how much the kids learned, and we would assign a grade and then go on to the next unit. So we would teach, test, and assign grades and go on. Well, as we look now to our newer models and newer curriculum orientations, we got to start with the end in mind. That's what they would say. That is, we have program standards that usually in the public schools are envisioned in the mission statement, or in higher ed, it will be the accreditation requirements and the outcomes that are expected. And then you set up courses to teach to those standards, to teach to um, what the program wanted the end result to be for that child, or the mission statement for one that graduated from that school. And so each of the schools would uh, develop the courses with these course objectives that would meet those standards. And then the teachers that taught those courses then would develop units that met the course objectives, and then assess the unit in a diagnostic assessment to see if really what was being taught was really needed. And as they taught, they went through several formative assessment techniques, so they knew that kids were staying on board, that were following them as they taught. And then finally, after you felt that 80% of the kids could get 80% of the material correct, you went with your summative assessments to see if you obtained the unit objectives. And if you didn't, you retaught it so that a majority of the kids would master that before you moved on. And so it was a cycle, a new assessment paradigm that asked teachers to make sure that all kids were learning. And when you looked at the public school, it usually started with the mission statement, and from that mission statement, the staff and school board adopted exit outcomes for each of the grade levels and for each of the courses in the secondary area. And then the teachers would come up with the course outcomes, develop their units based on those outcomes, and then each lesson then would be based on a unit outcome. And in essence, each lesson that you taught directly went back to what the mission statement said they wanted their child to be like when they graduated from that school. So it was a design down from where you want to end up, a design down to deliver up. That is, there was a scope and sequence of curriculum from kindergarten to 12th grade, or from the freshman to um, senior graduation for a college. It was a way of backward design to where you decided what you wanted the child to be like and you worked to get there. Well, in essence, when you teach, people always ask the questions, what are the keys to effective teaching and assessment? You don't want to be like Dr. Runyon, your old college professor, the one whose exam questions were not covered in class. Those days hopefully are over because you teach to the objective and you know how your kids are doing as you teach. Our keys to promoting effective assessment and effective teaching are basically three. Uh, you start with the premise that assessment attempts to answer the question, have students actually learned what we wanted them to learn? And then you teach, and as you teach, you use assessment almost all the time. You use formative assessments to build to a summative assessment. That is, um, a number of different ways to see how kids are mastering what you want them to believe or to do or to understand. And then there are no surprises in the final assessment, the summative assessment. You teach to the assessment, kids know what the game is going to be. So let's see how those translate into a class. As we look at effective assessment, we know that they are valid, systematic, and practical. And what we mean by that is that if it's valid, it's the degree to which the test measures what it claims to measure. That is, does your test have a strong relationship between what you said you wanted the kids to learn in the objective and what you taught? And then, was it systematic? Did it occur over a period of time that as the unit objectives were taught, you sort of measured that in a formative way so that kids, you knew which kids were having trouble mastering what concepts. And then it was practical. It was reflecting what the students had mastered towards the objective. And what we found is that the more frequent you assess kids, the higher the achievement level. So let's see how this framework might work for you as you taught a direct instruction type of lesson. Do you teach what you test, and do you test what you teach? Well, the first thing that you have to master, or what you want to use, are the objectives. That is, if you aim at nothing, you're going to hit nothing. And so you want to write objectives that can actually be assessed and actually you can teach in the amount of time that you have. And there are two ways of writing those objectives. One way is broken down into learner outcomes, and this is the way most curriculums are written. And it starts with student will be able to, and basically you decide what they will be able to do. And then another way of looking at objectives is to tell the student what they're going to do, under what conditions, and at what level of performance you will expect. For example, in an elementary setting, given 6 primary colors, the students will be able to identify 5. So you've set what they're going to do, under what conditions, given 6 primary colors, and at what level of performance. They're going to be able to identify 5 out of 6. And so Mager's objectives are more for elementary typically than for secondary. When you write objectives, they usually have, well, they have 3 domains. We stick a lot of times with the cognitive, but they're also psychomotor and affective domains. They each have their own taxonomy levels. For example, Bloom's taxonomy for writing cognitive objectives, that is what you want your kids to know. And we use here very measurable verbs at each of the levels, from a child being able to simply remember something, recall the facts, all the way up to where they create something. And to be able to create something, they have to understand the lower levels. They have to be able to remember what was taught. They need to understand it. They need to have applied it to new situations and draw connections between those situations and others. And then they kind of need to know how to evaluate it, to produce something new. So they build upon one another in the cognitive area. For example, if you wrote cognitive objectives on the 6 different levels, first one might be that the student will be able to identify the capitals of each state. That is simple knowledge recall. The student will be able to interpret the symbols on a weather map. That is, they're going to have to understand what the symbols are and be able to uh, um, comprehend it, explain it. The students will then be able to compute the miles per gallon for an auto trip. That is, they're going to apply what they learned about miles per gallon and apply it to a specific situation. At the next level, they'll be able to analyze something, to break it down, to, in essence, to, in this case, the student will be able to analyze the bias in a news story. And then the last level, or second to last level, they're going to be able to discriminate, compare and contrast things, and lastly, to design or create something at the end. To be able to do the design, the other 5 things usually need to be met too. There are also the psychomotor objectives, and we have, again, a taxonomy on those, from where you imitate something to where you perform it automatically. You go through 5 different steps. Each of these have their own types of verbs to show what level performance you're going to see that domain. For example, if you're going to hit a golf ball, if that was one of your PE lessons, student will be able to copy the golf swing. That is, or simply show that they can swing a club. Then they're going to be able to swing the club to hit the golf ball off the tee. Then they're going to be able to hit the golf ball off the tee airborne, and then be able to hit the golf ball off the tee into a fairway for a considerable distance. And then when you actually naturalize it, the student will be able to consistently hit the golf ball off the tee and in the fairway for a considerable distance. So you have different levels of psychomotor types of objectives. And the same thing applies to the affective objectives. That is, what you want a child to believe at the end of the lesson. And you move from simply listening to receiving to making it part of that person's character. For example, in the affective objective, students will be able to listen attentively to what you're teaching. And then they'll be able to participate in a class discussion about that belief. And then the students will be able to demonstrate a problem-solving attitude. And in this case, they'll be able to demonstrate what they believe about that. And then formulate a plan, or formulate an opinion. And then finally, it becomes part of their being. They display it regularly. So affective objectives move from receiving to characterization. So knowing how to write objectives is one of the fundamental keys to teaching, because you want to teach and assess to the objectives. And to teach, we're going to use old Madeline Hunter's model, modify it a little bit, but her 9 steps went from anticipatory set to closure. And we're going to throw in the different types of assessments that could be used as you use that direct instruction model. And this is a model that teaches material, that teaches stuff. First off, there's a readiness phase where you're going to find out what your kids already know, and you get them ready for it. Then you teach it. Then you have them practice with it, participate with the information, and then you're going to close. And during that time, you're going to use different types of assessments, from diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments. So let's put this model together and see how it works. For example, as you start, how do you know what your students really know about what you're going to teach? What level of knowledge or skill or understanding do they have as you begin the lesson? One of the elementary ways is to do a KWL chart where you have the kids write what they already know about the topic, what they would want to know, and then as you teach it, what they learned. So it is sort of a very broad way of looking at the progress of your teaching. Most of the time, especially in a teacher work sample for student teacher candidates, we teach to give a pretest. That is, you start with the end in mind. This is what you're going to have to be able to do at the end of the unit. So you test them. You don't really give them a grade, perhaps a participation grade, but you use a pretest to see what kids are going to be exposed to, and then it tells you what they already know and what they don't know. All kinds of different ways to use diagnostic, and we're going to show you some of those later on. But after you've found out what kids know, as you teach a daily lesson, you want to perhaps start, instead of saying turn to page 68, we're going to do problem 76 to 89. Start with an A set to focus kids' attention on what's going to be taught. The A set is an important part of teaching because it stimulates amazement. It gets a child interested in what you're going to teach, because really all knowledge, when you think about it, begins with wonder. I want to know why this occurs, and that leads to a lot more interest being shown as you teach. For example, in an anticipatory set, you want to relate to the child's past. What you're going to teach, you want to relate it and hook it to something a child already knows, and it needs to involve them. For example, you have them think about something. What do you think are the 5 characteristics of an effective teacher? Or I want you to draw a picture of an effective math teacher. What would that teacher be doing? Or we could read a passage, stimulate amazement, because all knowledge begins with wonder. What's that mean? Where you read something, or you have them write something from a prompt, or you have them listen to a speech or a recording or watch a video. But somehow you set the tone. You introduce what you're going to teach with an attention getter that hooks them to the lesson and is going to get them engaged in learning. And in a anticipatory set, you could use a number of formative different assessments, from admin slips to a brain ball. Brain ball is a good one. In essence, and I'm not going to go through all of these because you have a sheet that will list all of these and tell you how to use each. But brain ball could be a football during football season, or a baseball during baseball season, a plastic one. And what you do, you toss it to a child and ask them a question. Or you ask the question and you toss the ball out. And then you ask another question, that child would toss it to another child. But it goes around with kids tossing to other kids, where you could ask a number of questions about the topic that you're going to talk about. Second, once you got them hooked on what you're going to teach, then you tell them what they're going to learn and why. And this is, again, important. That is, you're going to tell them the objectives. You're not going to make teaching a guessing game, but you're going to tell them what they're going to know or be able to do or believe by the end of the lesson. Because we're going to set the target. Because if you aim at nothing, you get nothing. But you want to tell them what they're going to learn, but also important is you tell them why. Why do I need to know this? Why do I need to know the Pythagorean theorem? How can I use that? And that's a key to getting kids on board. Why? And that's sometimes hard to explain to kids. But the critical attributes of stating the objective and the purpose is giving you an overview of the lesson and also why I need to know that as I go through this curriculum. Um, Typically, teachers will write this on the board, or they will have it in their syllabus. A lot of teachers will have students write this in their notes, the objective. Simply because if you're teaching to the objective, your test is going to be the objectives. And you can go right down the line, and it should outline the test. So tell kids what they're going to learn and why. And then you teach. You present the information, direct instruction, but you're going to teach them the knowledge, skills, or attitudes that cover that objective. And I think a good way of doing this is a good speech outline. You tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and you tell them what you told them. Again, that's very verbal, but you teach. And as you do that, the more varied, novel, and vivid your strategies are, the more the kids are going to remember that. That is, as you look at the pyramid of learning, as you move from lecture, some would claim that you only remember 5% of that lecture after a year. If you read it, maybe 10%. If you show them, it may be 20. If you demonstrate it, it's up to 30. Or if you have them discuss it, it's up to 50. And if you have them do it, you're up there 75 to 90%, where they actually learn by doing. And for example, we can talk all day about what good teaching is, but until you do it, sometimes it's hard to understand. Also, the second item in instructional input is the level of stress. And some would claim that stress is a negative thing, but up to a certain point, it can be positive. That is, coaches know this very well, that performance increases as stress does up to a certain point, and then it starts to decline and more stressful. For example, a coach, a lot of times, will, knowing that this team they're playing today beat them by 25 points last time, might come in with not a rip-roaring speech, but a speech that calms them down. Whereas if we beat them by 30 points last time, you might come in with hellfire and brimstone to get them pumped up to play. But performance, and this also applies to individual kids. That is, certain kids up to a certain point get stressed out and they can't function. Good teachers kind of know, and good coaches kind of know where that stress level is, so that you optimize the stress so that they can perform. And then you model. Once you've taught what the objectives ask you to teach, you will illustrate it. You model it. What skill, what attitude. You demonstrate what's taught, because modeling's the best sermon. Here, you're going to go through again the key points if it's a new knowledge base, or you're going to do examples of applying that. You're going to demonstrate it if it's a skill, or you're going to illustrate the attitude. But the teacher models it, and hopefully it's correct. Sometimes you'll see the math teachers work a proof theorem, and they get to the end and it's correct, and so you got to start back again. But you want to practice that to make sure what you teach and what you model are correct. But again, the more models you offer, the better off you're going to be. For example, if you simply show a kindergarten class a red flower and you want them to draw a flower, guess what? Almost all your flowers are going to be what? Red. So the more models you offer, the better off you're going to be to a certain extent. Once you've shown them, you check for understanding. You check to see if kids really have learned what you thought they were going to learn. And it's a process of checking to see the essential knowledge, skills, or attitudes if they've achieved that. And here, most teachers will start with questions. And they use, hopefully, effective question techniques to check for understanding. For example, once you've taught, once you've modeled, you're asked a high number of questions to see if kids have understood it. And the second thing, and one of the most important things, is to have an equal distribution of questions so that all kids participate. For example, the chart we have here, uh, if I was watching a teacher in the classroom and this is what we saw, what might we say about the teaching? That is, and many beginning teachers start this way. They teach the center of the room because that's typically where your A and B students sit. And if you notice, all of the outlying students were never asked questions or interacted with. But you want, as best you can, to have an equal distribution of questions so that every kid participates. As you ask the question first, and then you wait 5 seconds, then use the student name, and then pause 5 seconds as they think about the answer, and um, then we're going to use one or two responses after that. But use the student name after questions. What you want to move away from are blurt outs. That is where the one or two kids in your class always answer the question. So move away from simply kids blurting out or raising their hands, where you're going to be asking the questions with equal distribution. If a kid gets it incorrect, you're going to provide correctives. If they get it correct, sometimes you give positive feedback. And I think the key is to keep kids on the hook. That is, if I ask a kid a question, I'm going to keep him on the hook. And if he says, I don't know, then I'm going to rephrase it. I'm going to give him clues, or I'm going to probe him so that he knows he's still going to have to answer. Because if you allow students to say, I don't know, and move on to the next student, you're going to see it kind of replicate itself throughout your class. But if a kid answers the question quickly and correctly, I'd just move on, ask a new question. If he's having to think and if he's hesitant about the question, then give him some short positive feedback and move on. If it's incorrect and simply careless, you know that he knows it, you correct it and ask him a new question. If it's incorrect and he just doesn't know it, you're going to rephrase it, simplify it, give him clues, or probe for the correct answer till he gets that answer. Because you want to keep them on the hook. But basically, checking for understanding, a lot of times teachers use questioning as the main way to find out that all kids understand it. There are many other ways, formative assessments, and you've got a whole list of these, basically more than what we show here on the screen. But for example, a core response. If I ask you what the 8 stages of the Hunter model were, and on the count of 3, I could tell exactly by listening and by who was not answering if they knew those 8 stages just by the core responses. And there's all kinds of other ways that you can check for understanding. Because here you get kids to play with the information, where kids will do more of the talking. And as you watch or listen, you can ascertain what kids have learned, or what, if the class haven't learned the material, you reteach it. But it's a place to correct misunderstandings. Typically, at this stage, a lot of beginning teachers will say, are there any questions? And really, that's not a check for understanding, because chances are, if it's near the end of the day or right before lunch, nobody's going to ask a question because they want to get going. Once you kind of know that students know the material, then you're going to put them on guided practice. And this is where students are going to be given the opportunity to practice the material, and you're going to be there as they learn that. But you give them time to practice, because practice makes perfect, doesn't it? Well, I would say no. Practice does not make perfect. I would say practice does make permanent. The more you do it, the more repetitions you have, the more permanent it's going to be. So, what do you want that practice to be? Well, you want perfect practice, makes perfect. So, what you want in guided practice are not kids making mistakes. You want them to be able to get 90% or more of what you're asking them to do correct. It could be through worksheets, it could be through board work or text problems, computer generated problems. It could be experiments, all kinds of. You could even play games with it. But you have kids practice that material with you present. Hopefully, 80 to 90% of that's going to be correct. Um, and students are monitored to make sure that they are correct. Um, Once you find out that most of the kids now can understand what you want them to do or believe, or what skill you want them to master, you put them on independent practice. And here, kids will practice without the teacher around. And what we know in the research is that it's not the amount of homework, but it's the frequency of the practice that counts. So it is better to give homework, 20 minutes of homework every night, than an hour and a half on Monday night. That is, it's the frequency that makes the difference rather than the amount of time that you give. Also, uh, we typically find that lower elementary grades homework is not that effective. So usually kindergarten, first grade, second grade tend to stay away from giving work at home. Um, but again, it's based on repetition. Um, it shouldn't be used, homework shouldn't be used to teach new material unless you're flipping your classroom. And flipping the classroom has a certain sequence of events that when they come back, it's kind of retaught, and practice is during the class time. Also, homework shouldn't be used as punishment, because if you use it as punishment, what do you teach kids about repetition, about homework? Well, you teach them that it is punishment. I'd also write it on the board so kids put it in their notebook so that they don't ask, what do we have to do again? Um, but again, homework is for repetition. Hopefully, it's 90% correct. And then you close. The last thing you do, instead of just moving on, you want to summarize what you've learned. They're the wrap-up activities. What did we learn in this lesson or this unit? And it really does signal the end of the class. It helps to organize the key points. Um, it shows if we need to reteach or additional practice is needed. But here again, you're going to involve the learner, the student. You're going to reinforce the objectives. Um, and the answer is, did you teach what you intended to teach? And did they learn what you intended to learn? And there are a number of formative assessments, like exit slips, to free writes, keyword summaries, all kinds of ideas that you can use as a closure to see if they're really ready to move on to a new subject or to a summative assessment. So you have a look at those in the list that we give you here in the module. As you finish your unit or your lesson, many times you have a summative assessment. How do you know what your students know? Usually these are used for grades. They're after a period of defined period of instruction. But they could be written tests, they could be projects, they could be portfolios, presentations, panel interviews. But did you teach what you test and test what you teach? In summative assessments, it doesn't always have to be a written test. If it is, you want to vary your questions from multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, short answer, because some kids will do certain questions better than others. If it's going to be performance, you could deal with the multiple intelligences if you wanted to, but you could have kids develop a video, a PowerPoint to teach another point of what you taught. You could have them run experiments. You'd have them debate on the issues that you taught, or have others teach others. But some sort of performance you could have. You could deal with products. You could have them do a report, a research paper, a journal, a concept map. You could have them doing autistic projects. All kinds of different ways that they could show to you through the different intelligences that they know that material. In some instances, personal conferences or team interviews would do well, or you could, in especially PE, do observational checklist, narratives, data collection of how much they can do, and the like. So all different types of ways that you can decide whether or not a student learned what you said you were going to learn. And once you've done that, if a kid hasn't learned that material, you might want to take the mastery learning orientation. They learn given time. That is, you teach, then you test with your summative assessment. And then if kids didn't achieve an 80% mastery, you're going to reteach it and retest it in a different way. Not the same test, but you give them something else to show that they know how to do the skill, or they know the material, or they believe certain things. And so as those kids are being retaught and retested, you put the kids that have mastered that into enrichment where they go beyond, they expand. And it should be a fun type of activity that other than busy work. So that the kids that are being retaught would like, well, I'm going to learn it the first time, so I don't have to, so I can do these other things. And then once you've retaught and retested, you move back and you keep going with the second round of instruction. So, and you don't keep reteaching, retesting. You only do it once, and you move on. But you can retest or reteach as you teach the next unit. So let's put it all together. What we don't want happening in any teaching is to make assessment a guessing game. And the way you keep from making it a guessing game is to teach to the objectives. And this Hunter model, from using diagnostic at the beginning to find out what they know and don't know, all the way through the teaching of the 9 steps until you get to a summative assessment, and using those formative assessments in between, is a great model to teach almost any skill, almost any cognitive objectives that you need, and effective objectives. So hopefully you use it. You'll find in your module a list of almost 100 different assessment ideas. I suggest that you tuck it in your planning book so that as you plan for the various lessons, you can vary your different types of assessment you'd use in the ASETs, in the teaching, in the checks for understanding, and then summative assessments. They will make learning fun. You're also going to find in the module some fun sponge activity assessments that I've used over the years that pretty well illustrate something negative about assessment. For example, the very first one, kids will follow 21 different directions, and if they read all the directions first and then do it, they're not going to be embarrassed. But you need to read all the directions first, and it illustrates that point. So those would be kind of fun if you want to use them in your class, if you're secondary, middle school, or above. Many of them will fit for that. But it teaches us a little bit about something about assessment. Well, that's pretty well it. If you teach what you test and test what you teach, you're going to be fine. Hopefully, this will give you some ideas.